welcome to the Westminster Institute. I'm Bob Riley, its director. And today we're particularly delighted to welcome Ambassador Joseph Mussomeli to discuss the historical context of the current crisis in Ukraine. Now, Ambassador Mussomeli served for almost 35 years as an American diplomat, including tours in Egypt, Afghanistan, Morocco, and the Philippines, where he served as Deputy Chief of Mission. He was also Deputy Chief of Mission in Bahrain. Ambassador Mussomeli served as U.S. Ambassador to Slovenia, and he was also the U.S. Ambassador to Cambodia. Before entering the U.S. Foreign Service in 1980, he worked as Deputy Attorney General in New Jersey. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You have written quite a bit in terms of the historical context of the current conflict in Ukraine and how we seem to have achieved a state of mutual incomprehension.
That's a good way to put it, yes.
You know, I know what's particularly valuable is to hear you speak about that historical context, but as an example of what I just said, I'm going to read two quick quotations. One is from the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg.
Yeah.
Now, quote, NATO's relationship with Ukraine is going to be decided by the 30 NATO allies and Ukraine, no one else, unquote. Now, the countervailing quote from President Vladimir Putin, quote, every country certainly has the right to choose the most acceptable way of ensuring its security, but it must be done in a way that doesn't infringe on the interests and undermine security of other countries, in this case, Russia. Ukraine is being pumped up with modern weapons, which poses a direct threat to Russia's security, unquote. So we have two ships passing in the night here, but according to you, that's not news. It goes back quite a way.
It goes back at least a decade, probably 3 decades, and it doesn't start with Putin. It really starts with Gorbachev and certainly with Yeltsin. Yeltsin made it clear, even though he was trying to be very friendly to us, that Ukraine was just a red line, a deep red line made in blood, that this would just be unacceptable. I know that one of the problems here is that we're not even thinking of Russia, we're just thinking of Putin. And the people who work on this issue in the State Department have a particularly deep personal loathing for Putin. And because of that, I think that makes it even harder for them to be objective or to see things from the Russian perspective.
What are they missing?
They're missing what we all learned in kindergarten. You always put at least for diplomats, you always put yourself in the other person's shoes. What would you do in his place? You know, and when you think of that, if you look at it really honestly and objectively, if you were the leader of Russia, probably wouldn't be as obnoxious as Putin, you wouldn't be as corrupt as Putin, you'd be more democratic and tolerant of people than Putin is. But when it comes to the Ukraine, I don't think anybody would be doing anything much different than what Putin is doing.
Whether it's a Secretary General of the Communist Party or a czar.
Anybody, yeah. Even if it were Yeltsin, even if it were Gorbachev today.
And how would you describe their concern in relation to Ukraine?
Well, they have a mix of concerns. I mean, the problem is they are talking past each other. The one main problem is that NATO keeps just saying we're no threat to Russia. And the Russians are supposed to just say, oh, okay, you're no threat to us. As if there aren't 100 historical instances where people have said they're not threats and then they are threats. In this particular case, we have the problem of Serbia, where for 40 years, NATO was truly a defensive organization. But then it decided in the early 1990s to attack Serbia, even though it had not been attacked by Serbia. You could argue all day that there were good reasons for them to attack. Certainly there was a humanitarian problem there. There were concerns about a genocide there. But NATO was not the right vehicle for doing that, because if you could say that NATO could attack Serbia, that was no threat to NATO, then why can't you say that in some future circumstance, NATO could attack Russia because Russia is mistreating some minority like the Chechens? What wouldn't justify that? They already have the Serbian precedent now, that they can legitimately use NATO resources to protect minorities or others within sovereign states that are not a threat to NATO.
I recall from that period the statement, I think by Maggie Thatcher, that Milosevic was Hitler. In other words, that you have to stop him now, or he has ambitions that will outstrip the abilities to defend against him, or it seems
That's
improbable.
Absurd.
It is.
And you're already seeing in the Ukraine invasion that even if NATO couldn't defend itself, the Russian tanks would never get to Berlin before they ran out of fuel. Their logistics, their organization is pathetic. They are not. If NATO says it's not a threat to Russia, the opposite is also very true. Russia is hardly a threat to NATO
because of its incapacity that's being demonstrated in Ukraine.
Right now.
But on the other hand, Russia's a country with an economy about the size of Italy's, but it dedicates it to the modernization of its nuclear weapons, the development of hypersonic weapons.
It has to do that.
And, elite professional military, not the conscripts that some of whom we're seeing in Ukraine. So that would be a cause of concern, particularly when Vladimir Putin has raised the nuclear issue in the context of this war. But let's not neglect more of the historical context. This intervention by NATO in Serbia, according to you, created quite a grievance in Russia.
Two of them. The first one is just the attack itself, since Serbia was not a threat, did not attack any NATO country, had no intentions of ever attacking any NATO country. So there's the first point that we've already talked about. The bigger, more fundamental point is that out of Serbia, they carved Kosovo. This violated 70 years of understanding and international law that you do not create new countries. We've had an understanding since World War II that all borders are sacred. We have that understanding because once you start letting reasonable arguments that these people suffered, these people were at risk of genocide, these people have been divided arbitrarily by colonial powers, there's lots of good reasons to change borders. But once you start that, there's nowhere to stop it. Africa is especially bad. If you start looking at justice and what makes reason, you change all the borders in Africa. So it's better to just leave the status quo as it is. And this is what we had in Europe also, until the United States and the Western Europeans decided to let Kosovo be a new country. This outraged Russia. And frankly, there's NATO countries that still haven't recognized Kosovo because of it.
Well, Russia saw itself as the protector of Slavs.
This is true also.
And that was an element in the Serbian. Mm-hmm. Now, when you mention no new countries, on the other hand, Yugoslavia was disintegrating.
Right, but they always had republics. It was always a pseudo-federated state.
Oh, I see. So that would be the integrity of that 70 years that was violated by the Kosovo creation.
Exactly. I mean, and remember also that early on, we didn't even want Yugoslavia to disintegrate.
Yes.
We were hoping they would stick together. When they didn't, it was natural that they should separate into their former republics. But Kosovo was never a republic. It was an autonomous state, and it should have remained so. And the Serbs, these things are never black and white. The Serbs should have been more tolerant of them, should have given them more autonomy for their schools, for their police force, things like that. But they should never have declared their own country.
Now, let's also delve further into the history of NATO expansion. There are two contending sides on this. Mm-hmm. The Russians claim that NATO promised that it wouldn't expand
an inch eastward.
And the Russians claimed that there were legal guarantees regarding this, the United States claims, well, there really weren't legal guarantees. The first such instance, it seems, is the agreement with Gorbachev for the reunification of Germany.
That's right.
And the Russian claim is, at that time, the condition for the agreement by what was then the Soviet Union to allow Germany to reunify was that NATO would not then move eastward from the border of Germany. Now, what was that? Is that true?
It is true that in convincing Gorbachev that when Germany unites, it should be tethered, I think was the word they used, tethered to NATO, because nobody wanted a unified Germany that was untethered to anyone. And that Baker did verbally assure them that we would not move an inch eastward. Now, that could be, the problem is it was never written down and it was never clarified what that meant. Baker later, I believe, said that he meant there would be no troops moved. Not that NATO's borders wouldn't be moved, but that US troops and German troops would stay where they were now. I think that's a little disingenuous. I think it was clear that what Gorbachev was worried about was a united Germany that could not be controlled. And so I don't think at that point people were really imagining that the whole Warsaw Pact was going to fall and join NATO. It may never have been envisioned by either side, but clearly the spirit, not the letter, because there were no letters, there was nothing written down, but the spirit of the times was that Russia was not going to be threatened by the encroachment of NATO closer and closer to its border.
Now, we've had as a guest on this program several times Dr. Andrei Illarionov, who was the key economic aide to President Putin in the 90s and one of the architects of the economic turnaround in Russia, who resigned when he saw the direction that the Russian state was taking in Putin as a Silovaki state, as he describes it. Now, he does look back sort of nostalgically at what he thinks as a Russian was a lost opportunity for NATO to extend its arms to Russia, not just in the association that was created, but
as an actual member.
Was that a reasonable expectation for Russia to have? And do you think it was a missed opportunity for NATO, or that it was so unrealistic that NATO never took it seriously?
They never took it seriously. But I think it is the worst mistake we've made since World War II. For the last 70 years, I can't think of anything that was a bigger mistake. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, nothing compares to not allowing. If you want a united Germany tethered to NATO, you certainly also want Russia tethered to NATO. There is no reason why, if we had Gorbachev asked in 1989, I believe, why not us? Why shouldn't we also join NATO? If we had taken that seriously, if we hadn't been so hubristic and triumphalist as we tend to be whenever we succeed, I think we'd be in a much better place now. Of course, Russia was not ready to join NATO in 1989 or 1995, but if we had started the process, if we had said you have to do this on democracy, you have to do this on human rights, you have to develop your military in this way, by 2000, by 2010 for sure, they could be a full-fledged member. Now, the counter-argument to that, which I think is nonsense, but it's there, is that if you don't have Russia as an adversary, why have NATO at all? Which is a very cynical view, but when you get down to it, that's what they're really saying. That, well, once Russia's part of us, then we don't have a raison d'etre to be.
Well, that's not an unreasonable argument, because it's a defensive alliance, and if it doesn't have anyone against whom to defend, what is its purpose?
But then the implicit admission there is that we want an enemy.
Yes.
And that is not acceptable.
Back in those days when the early 1990s, when the discussion was taking place about the potential expansion of NATO, I remember having a discussion with the former Undersecretary of Policy for Defense, Freddie Clay, who was a key strategic thinker in the Reagan administration, and it was his opinion that if you expand much further eastward from Poland, or parts of what had always been thought of as key states in Western Europe, the result would be to make Russia a permanent enemy.
Yeah.
Do you think that's the reason this has happened?
I think that's the core reason. There's others, of course, but that is, I think that we have not only ignored Russia's legitimate fears, but we've just laughed at them. And we've said they're not real, that he's just using this as a pretext to crack down at home and to divert attention from the problems the Russian people have. And it's too bad because, of course, Clay was not alone. Our real architect of the Cold War, George Kennan, said essentially the same thing. He said, you guys, if you expand NATO, you're going to play to the worst paranoia, the worst instincts of Russia. And then when they react, you're going to say, good thing we expanded NATO, because if we hadn't, Russia would be taking over those countries again.
On the other hand, isn't there some merit to the argument that Putin needs an external enemy to rally people to his side within Russia? Or at least we can look at the actual facts that when in 2014 he took Crimea, his approval ratings skyrocketed.
Yeah, but that's like Hitler doing the Anschluss. I mean, it was painless, bloodless. Of course, it helped his ratings. This is completely different, and he must have known. I mean, I don't know Putin's mind. I think he thought it was going to be easier, but he must have realized that it was going to be really bloody and messy to try to take the entire Ukraine. So I think that Putin tried very hard for several years to be friends with us. I think the fact that he was the first to call Bush after 9/11, the fact that he immediately opened up Russian airspace, offered his air bases for American planes, that he was doing intel sharing with us about the Taliban. I think that he really tried, that he didn't have the Russians veto the invasion of Iraq in 2003. He kept trying to accommodate us, as far as I could see, until about 2008. And then he sort of gave up. And since then, it's been another Cold War. And now not even cold anymore.
Which is the year of the war with Georgia.
Yeah, yeah. And the NATO saying explicitly that Georgia and Ukraine will become part of NATO. It's like we're intentionally just jabbing him, or jabbing Russia. I don't like to say him because that's what American policymakers want to think, that this is all about Putin, but it really isn't. Putin is not a particularly pleasant guy anymore, but this is the Russians. They will not accept this. The fact that they are even willing to risk nuclear war to prevent Ukraine from becoming a NATO member tells you something about how frightened they are, not how aggressive they are.
Well, one thing for sure is that this war was predictable.
Yeah, some of us predicted it 10 years ago.
But I mean, the repeated warnings by Putin, this is not speaking to the merits of his side of the question. It's just that he was extremely clear about the conditions that had to be met for what he thought was legitimate Russian security concerns about which you have spoken. So that was clear. They had to accept neutrality, they had to demilitarize, and they had to recognize Russian claims to Crimea and the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk.
Well, autonomy of those.
The autonomy, right, of those two. And there was a forum for the negotiation of these issues in the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements, which seems to have simply been left aside.
It's too bad, because they were moving forward. There was some progress. And it's unfortunate. I think the Crimea would always be a problem now, but giving some autonomy to the Russian-speaking provinces, that's frankly something that NATO should want. I mean, nobody's talking in the mainstream about how the Russian minority was discriminated against by the Ukraine majority. Not allowed to have schools in Russian. I mean, that would be considered a human rights violation in Western Europe. But nobody talks about that because in any war, we always want to think of our ally as purely white and the others as purely evil and black.
It's very interesting that Solzhenitsyn, as long ago as when he was writing the Gulag Archipelago,
Yeah.
said from his experience in the Gulag himself that the Ukrainians who were also there with him were brothers, but that they nursed legitimate historical grievances from Stalin's forced starvation in the 30s of the loss of 3 million some Ukrainians to that horror, and that Russia ought to allow for exactly what you are speaking of, and that Ukraine ought to allow for it too, and that is local autonomy for those groups who don't want to be affiliated with the one or the other. And that this was extremely complicated, but the only way to do this peacefully was an approach such as that.
Yeah. And in a way, you could argue that the Ukrainians are guilty of the same thing the Serbians were guilty of. Serbians were intolerant of the Kosovars. The Ukrainians were very intolerant. They weren't as bad. They didn't start slaughtering the Russian speakers, but they certainly were discriminating against them. And this need for autonomy is the only way to keep the nation states with the proper borders that they've had since World War II.
On the other hand, Putin was making the remarks that Ukraine isn't a real country.
Yeah, yes.
And subsequent to his invasion, I think he's discovered that it really is.
Yeah.
That the Ukrainians have a fierce a spirit of nationalism, and obviously are so courageously putting their lives on the line to defend it.
Yeah, they're Russia's brothers. Of course, they're going to be brave. They're going to be tough. They're going to suffer all they have to in order to try to be independent. You have to admire them.
Indeed. What was this necessary?
Not at all.
How could it have been prevented?
I think with just a little understanding of Russian history and the Russian psyche, with a little less arrogance on our part, with a little less personal animosity. I think we get back to that. Those people who are running the Russian policy in Washington hate Putin personally. And that's a big problem. Not Biden, probably not Blinken, but others definitely do. They want to see Putin humiliated. They want to see Russia put in its place as if it hasn't already been for the last 30 years. I think that it's a real Greek tragedy, because it's a tragedy that could have been so easily avoided. Except, like the ancient Greeks, the hubris got in the way. Not only on our side, Putin also is a very arrogant person. But I'd say of the two sides, in apportioning blame, far more of the blame goes to America than to Russia.
There is a reaction amongst many Ukrainians that they've been betrayed by the West.
I'm not sure why they think that. I worry that they've been given some sort of verbal assurances by some of these people in Washington that just be tough, don't compromise, you can't trust Putin, just stick to your guns, and we're behind you.
And we're behind you. And these protestations of the integrity of Ukraine's sovereignty were made frequently. And as it comes now, there is no help for them aside from the war material that is being provided.
Which makes it worse. I mean, that just expands and extends the suffering of both sides. If Russia fails, I don't think it's beyond them to use tactical nuclear weapons to subjugate Ukraine. I don't think they'll do that because I don't think they'll ultimately fail, but I don't think they could lose and still survive. Putin cannot survive.
So everything is on the block right now.
Yeah. And I think we've made it worse by moving our troops closer to the borders, by moving military equipment and weaponry to Ukraine. If I'm Putin, if I'm any leader, and I see this happening a few months ago, then I have to conclude I better strike soon. If I don't strike soon, and a year from now, there's going to be more casualties.
Well,
10 years from now, it's going to be impossible.
yeah, I was going to ask you that question, that this seemed to be a manufactured crisis by Putin because there was no imminent membership possibility for Ukraine. But he decided to bring it to a peak now, and you just suggested a reason as to why he may have done that.
That's right. I mean, even Putin knows that it's 10 years away. But what you do have is over the last year, movements of military equipment into Ukraine so that when there is a battle, it's going to be more bloody and messy. And you also have, when was it? November 10th, I believe. Never made the newspapers, but on November 10th, we signed a framework agreement with Ukraine, giving them their map to joining NATO. And at that point, I think Russia, Putin especially, but Russia in general, said they're really serious about this. They're going to give, and even before they join NATO, the United States may sign a bilateral agreement saying we will protect you. What might they do in the next few years? We better hit them now.
So you think that incited action sooner rather than later?
Yeah, even Robert Service wrote an article on this, that this was one of the last straw for Putin.
Well, of course, this isn't over, and there are unforeseen consequences. The United States has undertaken, as have NATO members, extraordinary economic sanctions against Russia, never before attempted against a sovereign country. The blockage of Russian banks, even the Central Bank of Russia, financial transactions, and other economic measures are being taken to increase the level of pain so that Putin will withdraw. And
then what?
And well, for Putin, then what? That would be the question.
And for Russia. That means that Ukraine will be part of NATO, Georgia will be part of NATO. Russia will be completely isolated.
Well, actually,
because we never offered them membership.
Well, they're not completely isolated because they have fallen solidly into the lap of China.
Yeah. This, unfortunately, I think I put that in my last article, that I think the real winner here, no matter what, is China. I mean, I think we've turned things upside down. The whole point of us making China so strong and recognizing China in the 70s was to counterbalance the Soviets and let them fight each other so that we're not alone. And now we've created this situation where Russia has no recourse but to count on China. And, the more economic sanctions we impose on them, the more reliant they are on China, and to a smaller degree India. And they will owe a great deal to China, and they'll pay their debt. 10 years from now, when China takes over Taiwan and starts expanding in other areas, Russia will stand side by side with them because of this.
Now, when these sanctions were announced, the reaction from Russia, from Putin, was that this was akin to an act of war. And this, of course, is not an exact parallel, but it reminded me of what happened in 1941 when President Franklin Roosevelt was so displeased with the behavior of the Japanese in China, and particularly when Vichy France gave it the permission to occupy Indochina, that to Roosevelt this was unacceptable, and therefore he instituted the oil and steel embargo against Japan. So attempting to achieve a geostrategic objective purely through economic means and not the military means that would have been necessary to do it, leaving Japan with its militaristic cabinet in the position of saying, well, we can't continue our wars or our consolidation of our Southeast Asian co-prosperity sphere without oil and without steel. So we're going to get weaker as a result of this, so we better strike now. And as we know, later in 41, we had Pearl Harbor. So do you think any kind of danger exists of a backlash of this kind?
I don't.
We imperil the existence of Russia to the extent that they lash out in this desperate way and widen this war?
I honestly don't see that. I don't see Putin attacking us or any NATO member right now, just for economic reasons. I don't see that ever happening. What I do see, which I think is almost as bad, is that if the economic sanctions are really effective, it isn't going to get Russia out of Ukraine. It's going to have Russia just implode. It's going to cause such problems in Russia that we're going to have chaos. And then we don't know what might happen. We don't know who will come into power. We don't know if you know, who will be taking control of their nuclear weapons if there's no central power. I think that while those in Washington who are doing this want Russia to get out of Ukraine, I don't think they've thought clearly enough what the consequences will be for Russia itself if Russia does that. The economic pain is one thing, but the social cohesion of the country could just break down completely, and that would be really bad.
Well, there certainly seem that there are going to be very grave consequences for other parts of the world. The obvious one is if you try to embargo Russian oil, which I think provides some 10% of the world's oil, the prices are going to skyrocket, as they already have. And of course, the countries that will be hurt the most from that are the ones who can't afford, the poorest countries, that higher price. The UN Food Agency has alerted countries to the danger of the consequences of a loss or diminution in the supply of Russian and Ukrainian wheat and sunflower oil, and that will particularly hit Africa very hard, and also some South Asian countries. It hit Pakistan very hard. So the pain may spread in unexpected ways that are going to cause a far larger crisis in the world. And of course, many people suggest that war adds to inflation.
Which is already at what, 7% now?
Which is more, no, it's actually higher now. And that this, of course, can occasion recessions in the United States and other countries. So,
yeah.
So we're undertaking.
Well, I honestly hadn't thought of the consequences to the third world in all this, but that's a very good point. But the main thing is to remember that in Washington, nobody will be to blame for this. They're never to blame.
Failure never has consequences in the State Department. I'm familiar with that syndrome. Well, the other very strange thing about this is that as NATO has chosen to expand, 16 countries when the Soviet Union disintegrated, and 14 new countries since that time, all countries moving more eastward toward Russia, and obviously the Baltic states right on the border of Russia. But at the same time, NATO has increased its defense responsibilities. It has drastically reduced the military means to meet those defense requirements. So Germany drastically cut its military forces. Great Britain has cut its military forces. And we have certainly cut military forces, and and in another extent degraded our military forces from multiple wars, which we haven't really even resupplied the ammunition we need to meet our commitments. So the Congress just recently passed, finally, an appropriation bill after letting the Defense Department limp along on a continuing resolution, and actually, I think, increased the defense budget for the first time above what will be the rate of inflation, though we're not sure, since that's going to be 8%. So we hear this, we see this extraordinary turnaround in Germany that has announced whether they are participating in this the sanctions against Russia. They have said they are not going to allow the Nord Stream 2 supply of Russian gas, and they have just announced major increases for the first time in their defense spending.
Right. Yeah.
Other European countries are making similar sounds. So one effect of this is that we and these countries might start taking our defense seriously.
Which some would say is a very good thing. And I would sort of agree with them that the Europeans have not been holding their share of this. On the other hand, I don't think it'll last unless we find ways to continue this conflict. I think if the Ukraine crisis ends in the next month or two, in a year, Europe will go back to what it was. I don't see them there. I may be wrong, but I just don't see much taste for militarism in any part of Western Europe.
Well, at the same time that Europe was cutting its military, expanding NATO membership, it proceeded to make itself even more reliant on Russian gas.
Yeah. They don't like nuclear power, especially the Germans don't. And so they need to get that gas somewhere. They should have thought of this 10 years ago when this crisis started to brew.
But that's the irony, that you would make yourself more dependent on the nation against whom you're supposedly defending yourself. I mean, that certainly instigated President Trump putting sanctions on Nord Stream 2, and of course President Biden removed those sanctions. But they're back on again.
Yeah.
So if indeed we begin taking our defense more seriously, and that is a side effect of this conflict, the nation that would be most worried about that would not be Russia, would be China.
Right, except China's probably delighted with this because our attention is in Europe now, and even if we increase our budget, that equipment and personnel will go to NATO. And I think this is going to actually weaken our defenses in the Pacific. We don't have the money, we don't have the capacity for augmenting both Europe and Asia. Our budgets, our deficits are way too high already. And with inflation as it is, I just don't see it.
What do you say to those who are commenting that seeing the cohesion amongst Western countries against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the great economic penalties that they're bringing down on Russia as a consequence, may give China pause about its plans to forcibly take Taiwan?
Really, people are saying that? They're more deluded than I thought.
Yes.
I think all this has taught China is that when they take Taiwan, they do it quickly. They knock out all the air assets the first day. They make sure they have their logistics in place, and within a few days it's over, so that the damn Western powers don't interfere too much.
Well, it's interesting that the Russian invasion didn't achieve that. Right. If that was their objective, they really failed.
They did, miserably.
They were supposed to do a kind of shock and awe invasion, but here we are weeks into it, and they still haven't achieved their objectives. Now, nor have they used everything they have to use.
Yeah, which is surprising.
So there is some kind of restraint, not only in relation to what's happening immediately in Ukraine, but in response to these economic sanctions. Russia hasn't fully retaliated.
No, but they're going to.
But they're going to. And they could do some very harmful and damaging things. Yeah. We've seen the skill of Russian hackers and cyber warriors before. Our electric grid is extremely vulnerable. Energy grid is extremely vulnerable. The cables crossing the Atlantic are extremely vulnerable.
Yeah.
Were they to be cut? There are very harmful escalatory things that could take place, and I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. I don't know about you.
I think that Putin is reluctant to do this. I think he just wants Ukraine settled, and then he's hoping everything will calm down. I think with China's quiet support, Russia can endure these sanctions for quite a while. And they could always do other things like nationalize McDonald's and
he's already
like
spoken of doing that.
Okay, so he doesn't have to be too aggressive if he could get this war over, and that's already been his biggest failure. As I've tried to explain, while we've miscalculated grossly, so has he. He never expected such violent and heroic defense by the Ukrainians. But you know, the real problem, as far as I see it, I'm sorry, is that there are people in Washington who are willing to fight this war to the last Ukrainian.
To the last Ukrainian, yeah.
They're very brave.
Here's a statement that the former Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, recently made in the last few days. I'm quoting from her here. Ukraine is the last defensible territory between the Russian military and our NATO Article 5 commitments to the Baltic states and Poland and Romania. And so I think we have to throw everything at it that we can, that the administration believes will not widen the war, and do it as quickly as we can. Unquote.
I don't understand. She used to be such a reasonable creature. I'm shocked at that. I would have expected, although she did think that the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was brilliant at the time, so she has misjudged before. I think that the whole point is that you need buffer zones between military alliances and organizations. Ukraine is ideal to be neutral, like Finland was neutral during the Cold War. I don't understand why they think it needs to be part of Putin's initial request was simply that Ukraine be neutral. Now that may no longer be possible to the Russians after all this blood, but that was ideal for NATO and for Russia to just have it neutral.
In about the second day of this war, President Zelensky said that they would be willing to offer neutrality, but he didn't. Had he said that 2 weeks before or 2 months before,
2 days before would have been fine.
That might have.
And I still think it's possible if they actually will, if it'll be a written treaty that the Americans sign up on. That, I mean, what Russia doesn't want is a treaty under duress that then Ukraine 5 years from now says, well, we didn't really mean it.
Yes. So Russia wants a constitutional change in Ukraine guaranteeing its neutrality. It wants recognition, as we already said, of Crimea and of the autonomy of Luhansk and Donetsk. But one wonders, after the expenditure of treasure and lives that Russia has made in there, whether that's all they want now, because it's very clear in the south, where they've been more successful, that they're going to have their land bridge from Crimea to Donetsk, so that and apparently they want to move even further westward to Odessa and take the entire Black Sea coast of Ukraine. Now,
people won't like this historical analogy, but I think it fits. Not on a moral level, but on a practical level. When Lincoln begins the Civil War, it's all about the Union. After all that blood and violence and death, it becomes about ending slavery. Once the war begins, you have to find a better justification for all the suffering and all the dead. So for the Russians now, after these last few weeks, I think they need something more psychologically and maybe even politically than just neutrality. Because now with all this blood expended, how do they justify that to their people? So they, just like with Lincoln making the Civil War more of a crusade against slavery to justify, they will maybe say something like Putin has suggested, that to the greater pan-Slavic sort of federation that he dreams of. I think that'd be unfortunate. I think neutrality was always what was good for both NATO and for Russia. And he's going to have a big problem trying to control Ukraine. I think a guerrilla war or massive civil disobedience is the future for the next 10, 20, 30 years if he tries that.
Well, are you contemplating that they'll try to take control of the entire country?
I fear that may be the consequence of this.
Well, I think every military expert I've heard from makes clear that they don't have enough troops to do that.
They don't.
Yeah.
And they would have to be extraordinarily brutal in order to even have a chance. And that would alienate everybody, even those who sympathize with them now.
Well, the problem is, let's say that they're not going to take the whole country, but they want to keep that sliver of land along the Black Sea coast. That region, however, is Ukrainian. It's not like Crimea, which was populated mainly by Russians.
Right.
So they would still, if they kept that property, it would be a thorn bleeding in the side of Ukraine. That, of course, they would have the undying antagonism of the Ukrainians in those areas.
Already have that, yeah.
They already have achieved that. And also the temptation for Ukrainians outside of that area to feed what's necessary to conduct a guerrilla war against them. So,
I mean, there are ways to finesse this, of course. They could ask for a lease, a 199-year lease of that property and never claim it as anything but Ukraine sovereign soil, but that they're just using it as a friendly, like we use Guantanamo, or the Brits used Hong Kong. But I don't think the Ukrainians would go for that, and I don't blame them. They shouldn't. The problem is, now that the war has begun, there's no really easy solutions. A month ago it was easy, but nobody in Washington would listen.
Well, so the off-ramps get harder to find.
Yeah, for sure.
Is there no way to get back to Minsk II that's been obviated by the conflict?
It would take both wisdom and courage, and they're both in short supply in Washington. I don't see it. The people there are so self-righteous. They're outraged by this invasion. They can't believe that, even though they knew it was going to happen, even though they provoked it, now they're outraged.
Well, the outrage isn't hard to understand. There's certainly a very strong emotional reaction to the brutality and the suffering under which the Ukrainians are going, and admiration for the extraordinary bravery that they're exhibiting.
I mean, this is true, but this is true in every war. You always, especially among Americans, we always support the underdog. We always feel that if you're smaller or weaker, you must be better and more honorable. But that's not always true. In this case, there's a good argument for it. But the Ukrainians can be very brutal too, historically. You know, they had as many pogroms against the Jews as the Russians did. Many of them welcomed the Nazis when the Nazis came through.
Well, for good reason.
Because of the famines.
They didn't know what the Nazis were going to do to them at that point.
Yeah, at that point. But then they even cooperated, some of them.
Yeah.
The thing is that every country's history is very black and white and modeled. And it's a trap, an emotional trap, to just think that because they're heroic, that's the end of it. That we shouldn't look further into the problems of this crisis.
Well, if I just get back to this idea that Russia will want more now because of what it's expended, it would the reaction by NATO and the United States and other Western countries, should they occupy the Black Sea and Sea of Azov coasts and say we're going to keep those, wouldn't that instigate the Western powers to continue with sanctions? And
yes,
it would.
I think so.
So
and
there
I think
would be no end to this.
It would be legitimate at that point.
Yeah.
You can't allow Russia to. I mean, Crimea, even fair-minded people in the West can say, well, that was just Khrushchev handing it over to Ukraine. It was really part of Russia for centuries. And it's a tit for tat for Kosovo. But when you go beyond that, then it's really gets out of control.
Now, you reacted to the Condoleezza Rice statement. I'd like to get your reaction to the proposal that the Polish MiG fighters be transferred to Ukraine, and their desire to send those jets to Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany to make sure it's NATO that transfers the jets rather than Poland all by itself. Now, here's an extremely interesting response to this by an editorialist, this one in the Wall Street Journal, talking about the Polish MiG fiasco. They say there is a risk of escalation in any war and needless provocation should be avoided, but the risk of giving Mr. Putin a veto over NATO actions is that it undermines the credibility of deterrence. I see
Wow.
The logic of that has...
Well, you know, if you're bright enough, you could make an argument for anything. That's ludicrous. If Putin was saying the Poles can't move their MiGs to Ramstein, or telling any NATO country what they could do with their military within NATO, then that would make perfect sense. But when you're talking about moving things outside of the NATO alliance into a war zone, what are they smoking? I don't get it.
Well, the reaction in Russia, or at least by Russian officials, to this proposal when it first surfaced, is that the nation, we would consider the nation that transfers these weapons to Ukraine a belligerent in the conflict.
Of course. That's why Poland doesn't want to do it directly.
And that's why,
madness.
I presume that's why President Biden has said NATO won't do it either, or the United States won't do it.
The first wise thing he's done in this. He hasn't listened to the others in Washington who have been pushing it.
Let me get your, this is another editorial by an individual saying that what's at stake in this conflict is the credibility of NATO. And I'm quoting now, "It's about signaling to Vladimir Putin that America and its chronically weak-willed allies will finally resist his ambition to extend Russia's ambit across Europe. Because a world in which such a regime is expanding its reach isn't a safe one for Americans."
Incredibly convoluted logic. Russia would never want to try to take over Europe. It wants to be part of Europe. And it has been alienated by us and by most of Western Europe. And I think it's not trying to form its own birthday party in Europe. It's just trying to ruin the party because it wasn't invited. And it doesn't have the capability or the will, I think, to threaten any NATO country. It's NATO that keeps moving closer to Russia, not Russia that's moving closer to NATO. It's a really fascinating, bizarre reasoning.
Well, it seems to be reasoning based upon a conception of Putin as a Soviet Secretary General of the party, right, whose ambitions are unlimited because of the nature of the Soviet ideology at the time.
Yeah, and he's tyrannical and dictatorial, but I don't think he's completely lost his mind. He's not Hitler. I think we keep getting into this mindset, and I've written about this several times, that for Americans, the problem isn't that they don't know history. For Americans, the real problem is that they only know one decade of history. All of history boils down to 1938 to 1948. Everything that's important to America starts with Chamberlain at Munich and ends with the Marshall Plan. And you could look at American history for the last 60 or 70 years, and whether it's Saddam Hussein or Ho Chi Minh or Kim Il-sung, it's always a new Hitler. We can't get it out of our damn minds that Hitler was unique. We have much better historical antecedents. World War I, our own Civil War, the Peloponnesian Wars. There's lots of history lessons to be learned, but the rest of history is just a footnote for Americans. All we ever focus on is that one decade. And it's worse than not knowing any history at all, because that decade was very aberrational in the 10,000 years of history, where you had somebody who truly wanted to take over the world, and you had the Marshall Plan that actually worked. I mean, think of all the mischief that's caused in Afghanistan and elsewhere. We keep thinking we could do in other countries what we did in Western Europe. We make these same mistakes over and over, whether it's Munich or Marshall Plan or Yalta. It's very frustrating. We really need to stop teaching that decade.
I'm also going to bring to your attention that in recent testimony, Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State, when asked about the possible end of this conflict, that either it would come with the victory of the Ukrainian people or when the people of Russia themselves decide to find new leadership.
Yeah.
So basically, I can imagine a Russian listening to that testimony or reading the transcript would guess from an official that high in the State Department that now U.S. policy is regime change in Russia.
But that's what Toria has always wanted. She would like to get rid of Putin. So would several others. That's unfortunate, but she sees it, and many see it, as a Manichaean struggle. We cannot be reasonable in a diplomatic way, because this is absolute good fighting absolute evil. And you don't compromise, you don't make concessions to evil. And that's the way they see it. And Putin is evil incarnate to them.
Well, Putin's worry, I think, for some time has been regime change. He wouldn't have needed a statement from Victoria Nuland to convince him, because he does believe the United States instigated the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. I think the Ukrainian people did that, but I mean the EU did it by opening the prospect of their membership. And
but that's legitimate. I mean, that's...
Yeah, creating a reaction from Russia that now we're losing Ukraine. It'll be in the West. And then Putin holding the United States responsible for instigating regime change in that country. So it wouldn't be unreasonable, since he did think that. I don't know whether you think there's any merit to such a perspective. I find it a little hard to believe.
I find it easy to believe that's what he thinks.
Yeah.
I find it hard to make a rational argument for it. But he's paranoid. Russia is paranoid. And if you get rid of Putin, I think Toria is wrong on this, that if you get rid of Putin, there may be a few years of, or maybe even a decade of peace with Russia, but it'll come back. And somewhere along the line, there'll be a Russian leader who will remember the humiliation of 2022, and they'll come back and there'll be another conflict. Unless somehow, if Putin is deposed, that we do a real olive branch to Russia this time and tether them to NATO. If we offer NATO membership to a new Russian leader, that might obviate this problem. But otherwise, it's not going to go away forever. The Russian people are not going to rise and all of a sudden decide we want NATO on our doorstep and we're not a member. No Russian leader is going to want that.
Let's close with a larger picture question of the character of Russia. I was a student of the Soviet Union. I avidly followed it. I read Soviet ideology. Of course, I read all the dissident literature, came to know some of those extraordinary people. And the hopes for a transformation of Russia after the fall of the Soviet regime, there were high hopes. Now, I've heard this both from former Russian dissidents, and I've heard it from scholars on Russia, like David Satter, who is, I think, one of the most profound writers on the subject of Russia, as he was in the Soviet Union for some years and expelled, and went back after the Soviet Union declined. And he will say, just as Vladimir Bukovsky said, Russia never faced up to its past. It never had the equivalent of what was required, as did Germany after the Nazis. They had their Nuremberg trials. Now, the suggestion, it was never that rump courts are set up to execute former communist leaders or to engage in blood retribution. The suggestion was that publicly these crimes would be admitted to, accounted for, and renounced, and that never happened. It was supposed to happen under Yeltsin, and that's why Bukovsky went over into the party archives to do research for material that could be used at such a trial, but that never happened. Now, David would say that Russia is still not a normal place because it hasn't.
I have to agree, it's not normal by
made
our
that accounting.
Yeah, but I don't know if
it's
that's
not simply that it's Russian and we're Western, or that it's Orthodox and we're Christian and Jewish. When I spent time in the Soviet Union and during its last days, the thing I heard most often, and this wasn't from dissidents, was that we just want to be normal. They just wanted to be normal. But when you scratched the surface to find out what they meant by that, you saw that they had lost the frame of reference because so much damage had been done in the Soviet Union since 1918. The babushkas were already gone, and there was no living memory of what was normal. Now, there was in Poland, which is why Poland recovered so quickly. But for Russia to become normal, something more needed to be done, and an invitation to join the West, that may be
I think that has to be a large component of it.
It has to be something that would instigate that accounting, though it's...
I mean, that could have been part of the whole NATO membership process, that there would be some sort of accounting and some sort of revelation of all the past. And it would have been possible in the 90s. Poland it was easy for because communism had been forced upon them by the Soviets. And then, of course, they were embraced by NATO very quickly, probably more quickly than they were qualified to join. But Russia, I really feel, I know that they really thought that after the fall of the Soviets, they were going to be embraced and they were finally going to become part of Europe. And we kicked them in the teeth as far as they see it.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time now, and I would like to thank Ambassador Joseph Musamelli for joining us today to discuss this terrible war in Ukraine and the larger historical context for it, both in terms of Russia, Ukraine, and the NATO countries. I would like to invite our audience to go to the Westminster Institute website to see our other offerings on our YouTube channel, including programs about Russia and Ukraine, as well as China and other foreign policy subjects. Thanks for joining us. I'm Robert Riley, Westminster Director.